Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for being here with us today. This is our fourth in our Salesforce Security Blind Spot series, and we're so excited to have Kyle Tobener from Copado with us, along with DigitSec CEO and founder Waqas Nazir. And without further ado, I'll go ahead and pass things off to these two security experts to introduce themselves and then kick things off.
Thank you, Andy. Welcome, everyone. I appreciate everybody making the time and joining us today. My name is Waqas Nazir. I'm the founder and CEO of DigitSec. We're a cybersecurity company in the Salesforce ecosystem and help companies address security needs within Salesforce. And really excited to be speaking with Kyle Tobener from Copado, who's the head of security and IT, and I'd like him to briefly introduce himself.
Hi, Waqas. Yes, thank you. So like you said, I'm currently the head of security at Copado. And prior to that, I spent 10 years at Salesforce on their enterprise security team. I was responsible for securing all the many Salesforce orgs at Salesforce.
That's quite a challenge, I would imagine.
Yes.
Addressing security for so many internal orgs.
Yes, there were many orgs. So it was a scale challenge and also a depth challenge because we had some of the biggest Salesforce orgs in the world.
Yeah, so you're probably quite familiar with complex security challenges. So we hope to learn from you a little bit today in the short session that we have. So today we're going to delve a little bit into the concept of third-party security, delve a little bit into supply chain within the Salesforce world, and maybe set the stage around what should we be doing as folks developing on the Salesforce platform to do it, to address the third-party security challenges. What's interesting is, like we saw last year, was a big push towards addressing third-party security. It was something that was always there, like a very understaffed department in many companies, which would like basically do paper-based audits for vendors and for software suppliers. But we saw with SolarWinds, with Okta, like there's a lot of concentrated effort now to address supply chain, because we've seen, even as practitioners, like often dev environments and pre-prod environments, and they're target-rich environments because people think that everybody's concentrated on production. So with that in mind, if you want to maybe share some of your perspective around what you've seen within the Salesforce world around third-party security, and then we can go into some of the specific areas around how to address it.
Yeah, so when I was at Salesforce, very early days, I got tasked with building our vendor security function, which was our third-party security function. And at that time, there really wasn't a lot of attention in this space. When I looked around, I had to talk to other people at large companies who had kind of had a head start on Salesforce. And we were coming up with a strategy together, sharing in meetups how to do this. And now fast forward 6-7 years, and it's kind of exploded everywhere, where it's supply chain security is a hot topic because we've seen major breaches occur. But I think it's a really important area, especially for Salesforce, because Salesforce is not just an app that you run. It's a platform and an ecosystem, and both of us are part of the ecosystem. We don't work at Salesforce, but we are third-party companies that interface with Salesforce, and there are many more. And not all of them are created equally. Some focus on security, some don't. Some introduce risks into your environment. So it's important to understand how all of the interconnections between Salesforce and the Salesforce ecosystem work, so you can secure your Salesforce org appropriately.
Yeah, and it will be interesting to see like any Salesforce org that does not have a third-party enabled solution, right? Like you said, it's a platform, and by design, the way companies use it is by extending it, right? Either they themselves create the third-party integrations, or they utilize a third-party, product off of their marketplace and things like that. So speaking of the challenges with third-party marketplaces, Salesforce offers AppExchange, right?
Mhm.
And that is a rich marketplace of, like, I think upwards of 4,000 solutions available to consumers. How easy is it for somebody to kind of just pick an app and install and start running with it in their org?
So at least in a Salesforce org, you do need elevated permissions to install packages. So not everyone in the org can install a Salesforce package, which is great. But there are lots of them, and lots of people will be requesting from their admins, hey, I want this package, go get it. And so I think administrators and people who run the Salesforce environment need to have some kind of approval process in place to make sure that the packages that they're adding kind of meet the requirements of the org, because there's a wide variety of packages in the AppExchange world. You've got the standard, fully reviewed, they've had a security review, they're listed, those packages, which can be small native packages all the way up to like massive third-party integrations. But there's also lots of unlisted packages. Both those companies that have a primary listing may have lots of other packages that they can add on top of it. And there are people who just host unlisted packages on the AppExchange and never go through the security review process and use their own external marketing to drive the installations. And so understanding what you're getting into when you're installing a third-party application is really important.
Yeah, and also what's interesting is, like, when you're installing a package, you have the ability to limit who should be using this app, right? And sometimes we've seen that is overly permissive. Like, if you have an application package that's just designed for a subset of your users, exposing it to the entire user base is not a good idea. And so I think just having some control around what is you're installing, but then who is the real end user for it is quite important. Because when an admin installs a package, they use their permissions, right, for the connections and the integrations and the APIs that get enabled for a specific application. And what's interesting, and shouldn't become a surprise to anyone, is like, if it's a Salesforce package which has Apex in it, Apex runs with system permissions.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're exposing a piece of code, you're actually exposing the entire functionality of that piece of code to that user, right, which has elevated privileges. So it's important to understand that although you may be thinking that this is just a little widget that enables somebody to do something, there's actually opening up further access to your entire system, perhaps, right? So have you seen that challenge, and how do you think that can be addressed, especially with black boxed AppExchange packages you don't really know about?
Yeah, so that's the thing is AppExchange packages are a black box. The namespace of the package prevents you from knowing a lot of what's inside of it, especially the code. So when you get a package that's gone through the security review process on Salesforce, that's a point in time review right when that package was submitted to the security team. And it looks for a lot of really fundamental things, lots of security issues, and tries to get them out of the packages. But then, it's only a point in time. And that company that may be listing that package may have a lot of surface area that's outside of the Salesforce AppExchange. And so you really need to understand the whole security posture of the company you're bringing into your Salesforce environment. Because if it's a one-person company that is running a huge, AWS environment that's integrated, and they don't have the time or attention or resources to secure that AWS environment well, there may be some exposure to your Salesforce data. Versus, there are some larger, more, security focused companies on the AppExchange where they have a SOC 2, for example. They've done the work to build up their security presence, and that when they're developing that code, they're following security best practices. But that's an important thing to consider for sure.
Right. And like you said, the vetting process is a point in time, right? And security, one thing that we know for sure, never is stagnant or the same. There's a saying that you're only as secure as the last time you reviewed yourself, right? And it is interesting that the attack surface that we've spoken of, like outside of just that package, is quite interesting, right? These solutions, like our solution included, interact with Salesforce, outside of the defined parameters of that platform, right? So what are some of these elements that somebody should be aware of when they're, creating a third-party connection or integrating with a third party, that, what is the implications of this entire integration?
In the context of the AppExchange, there's a lot of focus on hybrid applications, which have some componentry in Salesforce and some componentry outside of Salesforce, and native applications. And a lot of people would say, native applications are perfectly secure because they only live in Salesforce, but that's not always the case. I think one of the things about a hybrid application when it's listed on the AppExchange is they get a security review of the external components of Salesforce as well. People may not know that, but having done a lot of those AppExchange reviews myself, we would do penetration testing on the package in Salesforce and the third-party APIs and gateways that may exist outside of Salesforce. Versus when you have something that's 100% native, if it stays self-contained, great. But a lot of companies need the additional horsepower that comes with something like AWS or GCP or even Heroku that the governance limits of Salesforce can't provide. So a lot of 100% native packages have unlisted packages that they add on in order to add that horsepower with that third-party integration. So if you have a 100% native package and then they offer you an unlisted integration package, just know that that's not been reviewed by the Salesforce security team or anybody else, and it may not be as secure as something that is hybrid on the AppExchange and has gone through that full review process.
Right, and I think there's also the element of this hybrid solution where it requires you to integrate a third party within the environment, right? And Salesforce enables that through what is called the oAuth connected applications, right?
Yes.
And that is actually that, and correct me if I'm wrong, any user is able to do it because it's using the user's permissions. So whatever the user has access to, technically they can expose the same access to a third party, right? As long as they have some. So how can like a security savvy organization, control that?
So this is really important to understand this distinction. So I'll just clarify for everyone in the audience. AppExchange packages get installed from the AppExchange and into your org, and then they may have third-party integrations. oAuth integrations are that dialogue that you see that's like, do you authorize this service to connect to Salesforce, for example? And that doesn't necessarily equate one-to-one to an AppExchange package. Lots of companies out there have developed oAuth integrations for Salesforce that you can authorize that don't come in through the AppExchange. And users, regular standard users, have the ability to attempt to do that oAuth authorization. There are security controls inside of Salesforce that let you lock down oAuth integrations. One of the most common is IP range restrictions. So if a connection request comes in from a third party that's not within the IP range that's on your profile, that might get rejected. And so that's a way that a lot of organizations control those oAuth integrations. But if you go into your connected apps inside of Salesforce, you can see all of the different oAuth connections that exist in your organization. And most people get really surprised when they look at their connected apps listings, because there are probably quite a few they didn't expect to see there.
Yeah, and also there's the ability to limit which apps can be connected through oAuth, because in the end, that oAuth app is recognized by Salesforce to some degree because you have to generate a token on Salesforce. So some organizations have taken the approach where they're actually not allowed by default connecting apps, and then they actually whitelist what can be connected. And it's a really good approach to addressing in addition to IP range restrictions, because IP range restrictions actually help you just beyond the connection, right? It actually decreases your attack surface. So if you do trust, let's say, DigitSec or Copado, you only whitelist their ranges, right? So if somebody's coming outside of Copado, then you shouldn't be talking to that particular app because it's probably a malicious request, right? So that's another way to not like make it like a wild west, right? Where folks are able to just use their own. I'm just using my own permission, right? And then my own sometimes is the admin. So
Yes.
it becomes quite interesting.
The oAuth allow listing that you're referring to is a really effective feature for controlling the oAuth connections, and not enough people use that feature. Actually, I think one of the things that makes it challenging is you have to actually install the connected app into your org, but that extra layer of effort and sort of the administrative overhead that requires does help control all the different apps that get connected, which I think is a really good practice to maintain, because when you actually look at your connected app history, you can see there's so many connection requests from so many different third-party applications. And most of the time, what they're trying to do is export data from Salesforce and pull it into their solution to, whatever value they try to provide their customers. But what that leads to is kind of the exfiltration of your Salesforce data to all these third-party apps all over the place.
Right, and that's quite hard to trace as well, right? Because they're typically speaking over API, so you won't even know like which, unless you're doing event monitoring and things like that. It's very hard to tell like which app took which data and where does it reside now, right? So
absolutely, yeah.
So it's very hard to kind of contain the data security around that. So I think the other interesting element when it comes to third-party security and Salesforce is this concept of like securing like your actual supply chain, right? Your dev pipeline. You want to talk about some of the challenges that exist in that and how companies should tackle them?
Yeah, this is a really interesting one, because I think for Salesforce, in a lot of cases, the engineering team or the developer team for Salesforce is often walled off from maybe the developers that exist in the rest of the company. And I think even what we've seen at Copado is a lot of companies aren't even using source control for their Salesforce code. It's just living on someone's laptop and getting uploaded in change sets, not integrated with GitHub or GitLab or whatever. And so when you step out of that developer environment, one of the ways that a lot of developers have been advancing over the past few years is something called software composition analysis, which is having tools, scanners, and things that look at not only the code that you're developing, but the third-party libraries that are in your code that maybe have their own security vulnerabilities, and ensuring that you are maintaining the most recent versioning and the not vulnerable versions of whatever libraries you have included in your code. And Salesforce is no exception from this. Salesforce allows you to include third-party libraries, mostly like JavaScript libraries are what a lot of people use inside of their Salesforce code to do UI and things. And jQuery can fall out of date, and you have to maintain it. You have to patch it. You have to make sure you're using the latest version that doesn't have any vulnerabilities. And I think this is a missed area of security that a lot of people in the Salesforce ecosystem don't think about.
Yeah, and also, like you said, it's an area that people think Salesforce is sometimes, not affected by. And that's a very dangerous assumption, right? When it comes to security. And if you couple that with the fact that Salesforce encourages package-based development, so typically with SCA, you recommend that, there's no point in maintaining a third-party package that you rely on. It's better to reference it, right? So you're always building with the latest version of that. But Salesforce, recommends self-contained and not referenced resources. So if you wanted in a package to reference an external resource, you actually have to create a content security policy to say, hey, go to this third party and grab this resource and load it within my application. So while that's a security control to not allow every untrusted domain to load within Salesforce, from a composition analysis standpoint, it becomes a bit more complicated, because now you actually have to, as part of your build process or as part of your dev process, always have some script that actually gets the latest version of this, whatever libraries you're using, and then build it into your pipeline and then deploy. So it is a multi-pronged challenge because of Salesforce being a platform, and then this this recommendation around getting package-based development and the control on the platform itself to ensure you can't just reference evil sites or whatever within your domain.
You also make a really interesting point too about, updating the Salesforce packages. I think Salesforce, a lot of people love it because it focuses so much on backwards compatibility. There's API versioning going back years. And what we've seen at Copado is a lot of people will use very old versions of managed packages, even 2, 3, 4 years out of date, which from a, stability perspective, sure, it, not making changes to your environment maybe, gives you the appearance of stability. But in this day and age, security patches should be a regular thing. You should always be updating and patching anything you can, because companies are constantly releasing security fixes as they find security flaws in their code. And so if you spend 4 years ignoring the packages, package updates, that's 4 years, you don't know how many security updates were in those package updates, but probably a lot. And those should have been applied to your environment.
Right. No, that's a very good point. It's like, backward compatibility sometimes, is not in line with the security objectives, especially with, known issues which are available. And then another interesting element when it comes to Salesforce third-party security is like these unofficial third-party packages, right? Which are not AppExchange, they're not like any, but they're basically, nice, cool utilities that people have created open source projects for, and many people contribute to it. Do you see like that being a concern, and what are some of the ways that we can look out for those, because they are typically unmanaged. They sometimes don't even have a namespace, and they may exist in your environment and maybe not even aware of it.
Yeah. So unmanaged code is essentially just, it's as if you wrote the code yourself. You put it in the org. It has no namespace protection, like you said. And the namespace is really important when it comes to protecting secrets, specifically like if you have an API key or an oAuth token or something, because the best practice in Salesforce for protecting secrets is either named credentials or what we call a managed protected custom setting. And so if you have an unmanaged package that involves some kind of integration, for example, and it doesn't use named credentials, because named credentials aren't the right solution for every situation in code, you could have secrets in your code, which is a really, really bad practice. And that's another sort of supply chain exposure. If you've got a password or an API key in your code to a third party, anyone in the org who has access to the setup could go and find that password in the code.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you bring up another interesting point that, sometimes people don't realize is shared credentials to third-party integrations. So let's say, a vendor has not really thought through their integration, and they put all their tenants on the same secret. So in essence, Salesforce is doing their part in making sure that they're protecting your secret per se, but they're not protecting your design, right? So if you don't have per tenant secrets, you're actually, all your tenants have the same credential. So if that credential is compromised somehow, not only does that tenant have, users have the ability to go to the back end, but actually you can impact cross tenants, right? So one tenant can look at the other tenant's data or config or whatever that application does. So sometimes we see like people make this big assumption that since Salesforce is going to protect my credential, if I put it in a protected custom setting, I can share that credential across all my deployments for all my customers. And that is a pretty dangerous scenario. So it's important to generate like per tenant, credentials and secrets. So in the event that they might get compromised, even though Salesforce gives you named credentials and custom settings and things like that, you don't have the exposure across tenants. So I think that's an important element to understand when you're integrating with third parties. Like, hey, how do you manage secrets for your integration within your Salesforce package? Is it just secret for me, or is it the same API? So we've seen, like, unfortunately, some third-party vendors don't think of these attack vectors because they're thinking that everything is self-contained within Salesforce. There's no possible way to get to the credential. They don't say, think about the one scenario that actually can happen, and it'll be a pain to address that security breach, right? Because not only do you have to contain it, but you actually have to go across like how customers and actually generate new credentials. And so it's going to be a nightmare.
I feel like Salesforce has been releasing some features this year, some security features that were things I've wanted forever. And so on the topic of like shared credentials, one of the challenges we always had is if you have like an integration user, a user in your org that's specifically dedicated to third-party integrations, really the best practice should be you have a unique user for every integration, because you want to make sure that the permissions assigned to that user are only what the third party needs. So for example, let's say you have Copado and then you have DocuSign, for example. Do you really want to give your DocuSign integration the same permissions you give Copado to deploy code? Probably not. You want DocuSign to just have access to, opportunities and accounts where you're doing your signatures. And then for Copado, you don't want to give Copado access to your opportunities or accounts. You want to give Copado access to your metadata, but nothing else. So these separate accounts are important. But what I always heard from people was like, yeah, that's great, but it's really, really expensive. I need a dedicated user license for every single integration. That is a huge bill. So I just, earlier this year, Salesforce released a license tier for integrations specifically that's much, much cheaper. And I think that's a fantastic feature, because it takes out this negative incentive of separating out the credentials for each third-party integration. Now makes it much cheaper to dedicate the right level of permissions to every integration.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and people should utilize that feature, especially if it's an API connected app. There's no reason why you shouldn't be using an integration license. Is they're designed specifically to limit exposure within Salesforce. So a very good point. The other interesting element is like, maybe it's in the roadmap for Salesforce, is like read-only metadata versus write. So we're a vendor which only needs read access, right? Copado probably needs write access, but we by design have write access because Salesforce doesn't allow it. But that's, I think, some of the things that Salesforce recognizes and then addresses as they progress their platform. And if you're, not utilizing them, and the risk of like the earlier point you made that, don't touch it if it doesn't break. If it doesn't break, it's don't touch it. Then you're maybe missing out on a lot of security features that can help you with third-party security. I know we want to keep this session short. And then, we're at the 30-minute mark here. Before we start taking questions, any final thoughts or comments that you'd like to add?
Just to your point, I think the world of Salesforce is constantly evolving. So we've talked about some of the new features that Salesforce has announced here. I think staying up to date on the latest security features of Salesforce is always a good idea for anyone watching this webinar. Even myself, I read the release notes every release, because I think there's some really good, really security conscious people on the product team over at Salesforce, and they are making advancements that I think are really good for the platform. And so hopefully, in another 6 months, we could do another webinar like this and have a whole new set of things to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. Andy, do we have questions, or how are we looking?
Yes, absolutely. So yes, I have one here. What's the best way or process for updating a package that hasn't been updated in years? What things should I take into account?
Kyle, you want to take that one?
Yeah, it's a complicated answer, because if you haven't updated it in years, you're going to probably expect some kind of complication. So using a sandbox, a test environment to do the update there first, and running through your tests in that org. If you've got, a testing solution, like a functional testing solution, Copado offers a testing solution, not to pitch our products or anything, but like, running your test suite and ensuring that everything functions the way you expect once you make that patch is critical, because if you wait too long, 2 years is a lot of changes. There's going to be something unexpected in that change. That's where, I like DevOps and the idea of continuous deployment, because the more frequently you're making changes, the smaller that delta is. And so the easier it is to overcome those hurdles. So I think it may seem counterintuitive, but I think more rapid patching can lead to better stability because you make the hurdle much smaller to jump over every time.
Yeah, and I think one point that I can maybe add to this is sometimes like versioning up like many releases is hard, but versioning up, if it's like 4 releases, like, taking it in steps is easier because typically companies or package third-party developers say, hey, we have compatibility for the latest and the last 2, right? So if you're not in the latest and the last 2, chances are it's going to be a lot of headache for you to version up to the latest one. So sometimes it makes sense to like break up the upgrade to like a lower version first and then version up. Depending on like if you want to, take the chances and version up and then try to troubleshoot it with the vendor. That's another approach that we've seen, can work well.
Sounds great. Thank you, guys.
Question.
Absolutely. And yeah, we got another one here as well. Is there a good security checklist to go through when connecting a third-party app?
That is a good question.
That's a good question. If you want to go. Oh.
No, go ahead, Kyle.
So oftentimes, if you are at a company that has a security team, they have a process for new third parties. And so I think it depends. It always is, in my opinion, relevant to check with your security team and say, hey, I want to bring a new third party in. What are your requirements? I think most commonly looking for signs of security maturity can be important. So SOC 2 or ISO 27001, for example, those are security certifications that show that a company is invested in a baseline of security controls. And so, working with companies that invest in those levels of security, I think is a good practice. But if it's like, say, an unmanaged package, for example, that you want to add into your org, if you have some kind of security scanner that can look at that code and look for any vulnerabilities in that code, that can be a good first step too.
Yeah, and I think not having I think the question kind of alludes to this is like not having this requirement is a red flag. So if you're thinking about like what should my requirements be to onboard a third party, then if the answer is there's no requirements, it's a red flag. But if you do have, like Kyle said, a security team which actually has some protocol around, hey, if you want to onboard a third party, this is what we should, collect from them to ascertain whether they're secure or not, then you'll be in a better spot. But what's interesting and what we've somewhat realized is like sometimes when you're onboarding a third party on top of a third party, there's an abstraction layer, right? Salesforce in itself is a third party, right? So people think that since we've onboarded third, Salesforce already, maybe, anything above it is kind of okay. And the whole concept is that, every third party, even if it's on top of a third party, it should be considered a third party, right? And that, you should have the same rigor that when you brought in Salesforce, you did for, this is a third party that we're giving our data to. So here's another third party within Salesforce, but we still have access to some of our systems and data. So that's important to understand.
Thank you, gentlemen. All right, we have a couple more here. Next one up is, can I set up security checks as part of the DevOps lifecycle?
You can. So to set the stage here, by default, Salesforce has just released their DevOps Center, which has a very light sort of DevOps approach to deployments to Salesforce. But there are other tools. I work at Copado. There are others out there as well. Maybe you've built your own using something like Jenkins. So theoretically, you have set up a deployment process, a DevOps process to get code moving from lower environments up into your production org. If you haven't done that, then I'd say that is the first step, is just even having a DevOps process to begin with, getting your source code checked into something like GitHub or GitLab. There are lots of security tools built into the big Git providers that just give you a step up from nothing. But once you have that pipeline of moving code from lower environments to higher environments with whatever tool you have, then yes, most DevOps tools have hooks that allow you to bring in different kinds of checks into your deployment process, be it security scanning on the code, or potentially, compliance checks on the metadata. These can be really important features to ensure that changes going into your environment meet a baseline set of requirements. So for example, one metadata check I think is really important this day and age is if you have a community, for example, like a customer portal, making sure that you aren't exposing records on the community license or the community permission set or the guest user permission set that potentially could expose data very broadly. So Salesforce, there's been a lot in the news about Salesforce and sites, guest users and community users exposing data. And so you can actually do checks like that in your deployment process to ensure that no changes are made to those permission sets.
Great, thank you, Kyle. And then we got one more here, how to manage in DevOps CI/CD, or is it possible to do it?
I think that's kind of an extension of the question we were just talking about. So by default, Salesforce has a brand new thing called the DevOps Center, which is kind of like DevOps Lite. It's got a limited number of integrations to Git providers. If you are a larger Salesforce environment and that doesn't work for you, your options are either go with a third-party provider like Copado that offers a robust DevOps solution, or you can build your own with something like Jenkins, which is another solution that people use sometimes.
Yeah, and I think, like Kyle mentioned, these automations actually help you to do things consistently. For example, if you had built a control in your pipeline and you're actually rigorously following that pipeline, sometimes people just say, hey, just deploy it because it's a fire drill. But if you consistently follow that pipeline that you've defined, you can actually implement consistent checks, right? And that's the whole purpose of putting in DevOps is like, every time you ship the same to the same standard. So security actually should be addressed within, the DevOps pipeline in the best possible way, because you can define the security checks that you want as part of your DevOps pipeline, and they will get deployed, consistently across every change. And then there's, also the other, thing that we talked about before was like you're only as secure as the last time you were reviewed. You're also only as secure that as the last change that was reviewed. So even a small change that you're adding to your environment can have security implications. So it's important to do things uniformly. And that's where companies like Copado and Salesforce DevOps Center can help address those challenges.
Sounds good, gentlemen. Thank you so much. And with that, I think I don't see any more questions, so I think we're good to wrap up. And are there any final parting words before we go?
Thank you all for all the questions, and thank you for listening.
Yeah, thank you, Kyle, for making time. Appreciate your insights and your experience. So hopefully our audience was able to learn how to address third-party security within Salesforce. So, food for thought for them.
A great conversation. Thank you.
Sounds good. Thank you all.
Thank you, Andy. Take care.
All right, take care, everyone. Thank you, Kyle. Thank you, Waqas.
Bye-bye.
Bye.